Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a very senior corporate leader from Richmond, Virginia, USA, Mr. Richard Streitz. Richard, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ashutosh. It's great to be here.
Thank you. Richard is the Chief Operating Officer of RU Global Impact. He's also the Vice Chairman and co-founder of Billion Strong. And in his previous avatar, he was a Walt Disney Imagineer. And we're going to talk about Disney Imagineering a little later in our conversation. So Richard, before we talk about accessibility, inclusion, and Disney, tell me about your own journey in brief.
Well, sure. I started out, I was born and raised in Los Angeles in Southern California. So I was in the entertainment industry, and that's the industry that I immediately gravitated to at a very early age. At 10 years old, I was already starting to design sets and scenery for small productions in town and at school rather. And that graduated quickly to doing stuff in town. When you're working for free, it's very easy to get a lot of work. So that's how I sort of got into the industry. And by the time I went to University of Southern California, USC, and I was in their cinematography and theater arts school, which were combined at the time. And I was working on a production design and technical director degree there. And by the time I was doing all of that, I was working professionally in the industry. I was doing professional work. I was working on the Academy Award shows. I was doing film and TV and a lot of live theater opera with the New York City Opera and the LA Opera when they were in town, and so forth. And it was during that activity that I was noticed and got picked up by Walt Disney Imagineering, who saw me around and became familiar with my work, and I was hired by them shortly after one conversation with them.
Amazing.
So that's how I got into Imagineering, and it was through the Imagineering work that I became hypersensitive and aware of accessibility and inclusion.
So we're going to talk accessibility and inclusion first, and then we'll come to Imagineering. Sure. How did you first become involved in the field of global accessibility and inclusion?
Absolutely. So, as I said, I became aware of it. Certainly with the work at Imagineering, where the incorporation of accessibility and inclusiveness is just built into the fabric of the designing process. And so with that sensitivity and awareness to it, after I had left Disney and was consulting on my own, I was shocked at how the lack of that understanding of incorporation in the design process was how that was just not being done anywhere. And so I went on to create a large development project in Costa Rica that was going to be the first of its kind. This is many years ago now, where it was going to be built and designed from the ground up, a totally inclusive, accessible environment, a resort with hotels, shopping, business districts, a hospital, theme park, water park, etc. And it was during that process that I met Deborah Rue, who I brought in to help me assist with that. As I was dealing with other issues of the development, I was heading up the whole development. So I was dealing with legal issues and labor laws and government issues and so forth. And I needed someone to spearhead the accessibility aspect of it. I found Deborah Rue, who was and still is the top leading accessibility and inclusive expert globally recognized. And so I tapped her and asked her if she could join my project, and she graciously accepted that. And I was excited to have her on board. Well, pages fall off the calendar. The financial crisis hits. All the money that I had secured for doing the project went away, and life moved on. I came back. I was living in Costa Rica at the time. I came back, and that's how I started getting into it. After that, Deborah asked me to be part of her team, and her and I have been championing accessibility and inclusion now for over 10 years together.
Yep, I had a very, very interesting conversation with Deborah a couple of weeks or couple of months ago. So my next question, Richard, is that based on all the work that you're doing on accessibility and inclusion, what are some common misconceptions you have seen, and how do you address these?
Yeah, one of the largest misconceptions I think that people have about accessibility is that when they hear the word accessibility or inclusion, they think of ramps, they think of handlebars, in bathrooms, and this sort of thing, and they tend to really think only of the physical aspects in regard to physical access, when in truth a much larger part of the population is in the invisible, dealing with cognitive and sensory type of accommodations,
Right.
and issues. So that I think is one of the largest misconceptions. And from a business aspect, another misconception is that making something accessible will cost you lots of money or be very disruptive to a corporation's processes. And that's just simply not true. If one is intelligent about how they go about making things accessible and more inclusive to their workforce or to their customers and clients, there's no more money. It's just a matter of being strategic about how you implement it. And at the end of the day, you're increasing your usefulness of your services and products to a much broader part of the population.
What a great response. Thank you. And Richard, what role does technology play in enhancing accessibility and inclusion, particularly with emerging technologies like Web 3.0, blockchain, and AI?
Yeah, those are really hypercritical nowadays, as they are being woven into everything that we do in our daily lives. From our smartphones to interactions with businesses, banks, education, and even entertainment. And so the incorporation of a lot of these. So, for example, Web 3.0, the decentralized aspects of that being incorporated into the blockchain, which is happening rapidly. Incorporation of AR and VR, and then artificial intelligence. These are all things that all enhance the tools that are being created, the actual physical hardware pieces, for example, like wearable hardware, wearable technologies,
Yeah.
That are dramatically enhancing the capabilities and abilities, allowing individuals to be much more productive in their work and duties. And that's not just for persons with disabilities or limited abilities. This is for everybody, right? These ends up being tools that enhance productivity for everyone.
Correct. Well said. And when you are designing these large scale projects, how do you balance the need for innovative design with the requirement of accessibility?
Well, so balancing the need is a matter of understanding when you're starting out on a project. And when you're starting out on a project, it's defining what are the goals of that project, and lots of things to consider. Regionally, what are the customs, what are the cultural sensitivities of an area. All of these things have to be wrapped and incorporated into the design process. One of the key things that's important is having individuals from members of the community with lived experiences be part of that design process. That's absolute critical component of making sure that when you're designing something, and this works is important for either a large project or a small project. It doesn't matter. One must always go through the filter of those individuals with lived experiences, individuals who are blind, maybe mobility challenged, cognitive, to make sure that you are getting the right sort of cross-section of society. One of the things that's important is that we all end up being, through the course of our life, members of this community, either through accident or through sickness, illness, and then just the aging process alone. We inevitably fall into all of these different categories through our life's journey. So it is important that we build things that allow us to be able to continue to be able to do what we want to do: live, work, play, and thrive in our communities and the environment. So that's, these are all things that are essential, and why it's important to incorporate all this into the design process.
And is there a process you follow to be able to ensure that the voices of some of these people with disabilities are heard and then incorporated in the design process?
Um, so, well, yeah, I think the um, creating focus groups is something that is really important into allowing their voices to be heard.
Mm.
Making sure that you have that back and forth of the design and engineering process, whether it's a product, a service,
Mm.
um, and so forth. I think that that's the best way to go about incorporating those voices.
Mm.
Is making sure that they're heard,
Right.
and you allow a platform for that to happen as you go through the process.
Well said. So two more questions relating to accessibility, and then I want to move to Imagineering. What are some of the most successful strategies you have implemented to improve accessibility and inclusion?
Um, Yeah, well, boy, there's a lot of different strategies that get into this, so one of the key things, as I mentioned, is early involvement of stakeholders. You've got to have people um, who are at the point of at the pinnacle of the benefactors of whatever it is that you're doing in regard to the project. So incorporating those individuals that are the stakeholders, that I think is hypercritical. Incorporating universal design principles and practices, right? Though that again is something that helps standardize the process in making sure that what you're doing and what you're creating has some level of continuity with other products and services. This is important for especially individuals with cognitive, and that we establish these sorts of best practices. It also makes it easier for everyone through the design manufacturing process, as well as through the implementation and the customer user or the end user usability of the products. You know, User-centered design is something else that's really, really important. It's important to realize that not to design something for the sake of technology, but you're designing something for the actual human user at the end of the day, and never losing sight of that. Sometimes I think products get, and this is something that we see with designers and engineers, they end up getting so entwined with the technology itself that the actual end user ends up being an afterthought, as opposed to incorporating all of these great technologies into a product, which ends up making it either clunky or complicated for the end user to use and so forth. So making that, I think, incorporating a user-centered design is something that, again, is really important. And having that feedback loop, again, of incorporating individuals into that design process. Scalability is something else that I think is really important. You've got to, whatever you do, you've got to create something that has flexibility in its ultimate end use, as well as sustainability. It's no good to create a product that is a year later, not valuable anymore, or not viable as a product that can't be serviced or so forth. So the flexibility of its use, and sustainability of its function, and its prolonged life is something I think that are also important. There's a lot of different metrics that I could go over that incorporate, but those are some highlights.
No, but that's fantastic. But for my viewers and listeners, could you give me an example of how an inclusive design has positively impacted a community or an individual or individuals?
Well, sure. So we can. So there are lots of different ways. Public transportation through wayfinding technology, that is something that's really good. Education and employment, incorporations of technologies into digital platforms that are leveraged for both that, for education and employment. I think public spaces, accessible public spaces, is another area that is really important for individuals to navigate around. Healthcare, like telehealth services, and and medical facilities,
Mm.
having them accessible by incorporating a lot of these
Yeah.
technologies. That's something that's really, really important.
Mm.
Museums
Yeah.
and
Absolutely.
even just retail and entertainment is
Mm.
also, something
Fascinating.
that by incorporating other. So there's lots of examples, and I can
Mm.
certainly go, if you want, I can go into more
No, no, no,
detail
no. I agree
about
with you.
that.
And I
But
think you've given us some very interesting thoughts for my viewers and listeners to think about. Richard, now let's talk about Disney and your Imagineering experience. Disney
mm,
is a brand, I think, that is probably known in every single country of the world. And what you people have delivered uh, is something which I think is unparalleled. But my question to you is, can you describe your experience as a Disney Imagineer and how it changed your approach to design and creativity?
Absolutely. It was, as a young man, right, right out of school, to being able to be hired into this amazing organization is something that I am still eternally grateful for having that opportunity. And I was very cognizant of that honor every single day I was there. I never took any of that for granted. An amazing organization to work for. In embedded in me uh, uh, techniques, strategies, and processes that I carry, into everything that I do. I can't help but not
Mm.
do it that way. Certainly becoming aware of the inclusiveness, designing things for people from 1 to 101, people of all backgrounds, all cultural backgrounds, people of all varying abilities. These are things that are just paramount to how we went about designing process, and that has stuck with me through my life's journey. And again, on any project that I'm engaged with, the honor of working with just amazing people in the organization, legends, that during the period of time that I was there, many of them were all still living, and having the opportunity to break bread with them and lunch and so forth, and casually have conversations and pick their bread, and their willingness to share. That was the thing that was also just so amazing. It was
Mm.
such a giving environment where you could ask any question to anybody, and they
Yeah.
would sit down and give you a thoughtful answer, regardless of who you were. And that, I think, is something that I also, as an executive, I take that style and methodology with me.
Mm. Well said. But Disney also is an organization, Richard, which has managed to convert an incredible storytelling expertise into experiences through their different kinds of rides and so on. I'd love to get your perspective on how or what went into converting this amazing vision and integrating it into the attractions in different theme parks.
Well, yeah, that's storytelling is the root of all processes, and regardless of any project that
Mm.
you're doing, product, service, whatever.
Mm.
Um, Coming up with a story is I think hypercritical for all individuals, all team members, to be able to have that in place in front of them, so that they have a roadmap to be able to allow them to do their various different tasks and through across different disciplines. That commonality and that singles in that story is just so important. So incorporating, taking any story, the developing the stories is an extremely long and iterative process.
Mm.
It's not necessarily a straight line. It takes many curves and turns and loops, and sometimes you have to kind of backtrack, and say, oh well, that didn't work because of X, Y, and Z. Taking it through a number of different filters, especially
Mm.
since we, working with global audiences, it's important that you take these stories, whatever they are, and put them through cultural filters,
Mm.
so that there is that level of sensitivity that's built
Right.
into what we're incorporating.
Mm.
These are the things that are just really profoundly important. So that's how you can take a story and take it through a distilling process. It starts out with just 5, 6, 7 people in a room, outlining, creating a sort of a narrative. that then goes out to a bunch of different people. You get feedback, come back, and then you have now 20 people that are adding to it and expanding it and taking it in different places, and you explore those different avenues. Some work, some don't work, but at the end of the day, through this iterative process, which can take depending on the attraction, it can take a couple of years to develop a full story and flush it out to a point where now you can incorporate it into an attraction, a land, an entire park.
And Disney has some of the most iconic rides, like a Magic Kingdom or an Epcot Center in Disneyland, and I visited all of them, even though I was much older. But could you share some of the behind the scenes insights into the development and enhancement of some of these projects?
Oh, I have lots of stories, more than we have time for, but I will give you a couple of my babies. So Tower of Terror, I don't know if you're familiar with Tower of Terror or if you're in it. That's one of my babies. So that's well, I say my babies, my and a couple hundred other individuals that worked on the project. But I think we all take pride in some self-ownership of that collaborative effort. In building that, it's an elevator attraction that's a free fall, and it's with a storyline wrapped around it, which story actually has recently changed from what I understand. It was Twilight Zone, Tower of Terror when we created it initially. The Otis elevator was, because it is a giant elevator in essence, a giant commercial style elevator, like you would see in a large warehouse, and the guests are the payload. So to move individuals up and down quickly like that and produce the feeling of free fall, it turned out that free falling, gravity wasn't fast enough. It didn't create enough thrill. So the guests are actually pulled down, and to create the G-forces that are necessary to give the feeling of weightlessness. In doing that, we needed to have giant cable drums that are used actually in diamond and opal mines. So these are giant, large cable drums. They were so large, in fact, that they had to be installed right as steel was being erected. So very, very, very early on. This created complications because the precision of their placement was, utterly important, without any walls or anything else and utility corridors or anything in place. It was just steel, and then these drums had to be flown in. They had to be flown in with helicopter because of their size, and we had to do that early in the morning so that there was no traffic, as in case there was an incident where maybe the drum fell off of its carrier, off the helicopter or something like that, that it would not hurt anyone. It was a big deal, but that was a very interesting thing and an amazing day, that the visuals of these giant cable drums being lowered on top of these steel structures before anything was built around it.
Incredible. What a story. Thank you. I have time for one more question, Richard. One has always heard that there are, Walt Disney left behind a huge number of rides. And if Disney company keeps on implementing, they probably have enough to implement for the next God knows how many years. How did you, as an Imagineer, and all your colleagues incorporate the principles of Disney's attention to detail and guest experience into your projects?
The legacy. This is something that is, again, just is a testament to Walt's original concepts, and the propagation of that belief in dealing with collaboration. It's so important, the collaborative process. As I said, there are hundreds of people that are involved on these projects. It starts out as a small team, but every step of the way, as it transitions to the next phase, it exponentially increases with numbers of individuals until there's literally 2,000-3,000 people involved with the project by the time it's done. And so, taking it through each one of those phases, being true to the story, is something that as I mentioned, is really hypercritical to keeping everyone in line, but the dedication everyone has, and the level of responsibility that I think all the designers have in carrying that legacy, making sure that everything that we do is always geared toward the best guest experience possible. Now, oftentimes conflicting with that are the finance people who are saying, well, it costs too much. You got to know, we can't do that. That's way too much money. But at the end of the day, the money issues aside, the ultimate guiding post is the end guest experience. What is going to create the best guest user experience and creating a good value for their overall engagement with the park in the day, or with the attraction. So that, I think, is something that is how we go about making sure that the legacy of the vision of Walt himself is carried through by tradition, by learning from the younger members coming into the company, and that information being distilled to them from the older members, the older individuals. I think that process, that sort of master apprentice, if you will, mentality, is something that is critically important, and I think has served the company very well in that methodology of continuing to perpetuate the traditions that Walt laid down.
How amazing. Richard, on that note, I just want to say thank you so much for speaking to me about your own amazing journey. I think we covered a lot of ground on accessibility and inclusion that you're doing at RU Global Impact. Thank you also for talking to me at such length about some of your experiences with Disney. I think, all the experience with Disney could, carry on for another 30 minutes of conversation, because it's such a well-loved brand all over the world. And I'm sure I could continue chatting with you about Disney and all the amazing things the parks do. But thank you for speaking to me today, and all the very best to you.
Thank you so much, Ashutosh. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you for having me on the program.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website, www.tbcy.in, to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.